Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a journey that is not merely about death, but about what consciousness truly is when everything we call life falls away. Today we begin with the first day after death, the moment when the deceased awakens not as a body, but as awareness itself. And what the Tibetan Book of the Dead reveals is astonishing. Death is not disappearance, but the liberation of consciousness. This is not metaphor. It is a description of what the mind experiences when its final illusions collapse. On death as the final stripping away of illusion. We tend to imagine death as annihilation, a void, an ending. But in the Tibetan tradition, and increasingly in neuroscience and depth, psychology, death is understood as something far more profound. It is the moment when all artificial boundaries dissolve. Your name, your story, your memories, your victories and failures. Everything you thought was you begins to fall away like dust. And what remains? Pure awareness, the silent witness, the I beneath the personal identity. The Tibetan Book of the Dead Bardo Thodol maps this moment with extraordinary precision. Although written for the deceased, it is in fact a guide to the living. Because the landscape the dead walk through is the same landscape we walk through every night in dreams, and every day in the depths of our subconscious. This is not an external heaven or hell. This is the inner architecture of your own mind. 2. The first day when the soul looks down at its own body. Now imagine the deceased. The moment the breath stops, the heart falls silent. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than biological cessation. But from the inside, another reality begins. The physical eyes have closed, but the eyes of consciousness have opened. The deceased looks down and sees a startling sight, their own lifeless body lying on the bed or the ground. And then comes the first great philosophical question. If that is my body, and I am the one observing it, then who am I? This is not a poetic question. It is the first awakening. The recognition that consciousness was never identical with the flesh that contained it. Freud described the death drive thanatos, not merely as the desire toward destruction, but as the instinct to dissolve the ego and return to a more fundamental unity. And in this first moment after death, the soul experiences both the joy of dissolution, freedom from limitation, and the terror of disappearance, fear of losing identity. This tension marks the doorway into the Bardo, the in-between realm where consciousness is confronted with its own truth. For many in the West, the word Bardo may sound mystical or exotic, but philosophically it refers to something universal, a transitional state, a gap between what was and what will be, a psychological and spiritual interval. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo lasts up to 49 days, during which the soul has a rare chance to awaken from its illusions and break free from rebirth. But here is the deeper teaching, the part Western psychology often agrees with. The Bardo is not only after death, it is within us right now. We enter mini Bardos every time we lose someone, lose a job, lose a belief, lose our identity, confront our own unconscious, face the collapse of something we thought was permanent. The death of the ego is a rehearsal for the death of the body. Thus, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is not a religious book. It is a manual for awakening. 4. The monk speaks sound as a bridge to the disembodied mind. On the first day after death, a monk kneels beside the body and begins to read aloud. But his voice is not meant for the living. It is a lifeline thrown into the ocean of consciousness. When the monk speaks, his words function not as language, but as frequency of vibration that the wandering soul can perceive even without ears. This is not superstition. Modern physics tells us sound is vibration. Vibration is energy. Consciousness responds to energy. The monk's chant is like a lighthouse for a ship, lost in an unfamiliar sea. His words say, "Do not fear the light. Do not cling to your memories. Do not run from the truth. Because the moment the soul turns away from the pure light, the clear light of reality, it begins to fall back into habits, illusions, and eventually rebirth. This is why guidance matters. This is why the voice is essential. In Western psychological terms, death is the collapse of the ego boundary. The conscious mind dissolves, and the unconscious expands without limit. This is why the Tibetan tradition describes the soul seeing brilliant lights, frightening shapes, unfamiliar sounds, overwhelming clarity, overwhelming fear. None of these are external entities. They are projections of the mind, magnified now that the body no longer shields consciousness from its own depth. What we experience after death is what we carried within us during life, but intensified. 6. The soul's first realization. I am not the body. Back to the deceased, as they observe their former body, a realization dawns. That body was a garment I wore, but I am the awareness that witnessed everything. This insight is the foundation of nearly every mystical tradition. Stoicism said, "You are not your flesh, you are your ruling mind." Christianity said the body dies, but the spirit returns to God. Plato taught that the body is a temporary prison of the soul. Hinduism says the body is a costume worn by the Atman. And neuroscience increasingly argues that consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical processes alone. Ironically, death may be the first time a person realizes what they truly are. 7. Death is not the end. It is the revelation. So when the Tibetan text says, "Death is not disappearance, but the liberation of consciousness," it is not announcing a doctrine. It is describing an experience. Death is the moment truth reveals itself. The moment consciousness stops pretending to be a personality, a profession, or a name. Death ends the story, but awakens the storyteller. 8. This is not religion. It is inner science. Many Westerners hear these teachings and assume they belong to religion. But the Tibetan Book of the Dead is more psychology than theology. It tells us how fear works, how attachment works, how identity dissolves, how consciousness perceives itself, how illusions arise, how liberation is possible. It is a manual for understanding the mind under the most extreme conditions, the moment of death. This is why Carl Jung encouraged Western psychologists to read the Bardo, because it reveals what the unconscious looks like when it is fully awake. 9. Why we study the first day. You may ask, why does this matter to the living? Because the first day after death reflects the deepest patterns of our inner life, our fear of letting go, our clinging to identity, our blindness to our deeper nature, our struggle with impermanence, our longing for truth, our avoidance of truth. Every fear we face in life is a small rehearsal for the moment we face ourselves without the body. This is why studying the first day of Bardo is not about preparing for death. It is about understanding life. If you wish to continue this journey through philosophy, psychology, sacred texts, and the deepest questions of consciousness, this channel speaks about death. But in truth, we are learning how to live more honestly, more consciously, and more courageously. Thank you for walking this first step with me. The journey continues. Today we step into one of the most mysterious moments in the entire journey of consciousness, the very first day after death, when the soul sheds its senses, encounters pure vibration, and faces the blinding light of its true nature. But before we begin, remember, this is not a religious sermon nor a mystical fantasy. This is a philosophical, psychological, and metaphysical exploration. into what the Tibetan Book of the Dead calls the most critical moment of existence, the moment when awareness confronts itself. One, the soul as a pure, wave being, a shift beyond the senses. In spiritual psychology and Western parapsychology, the moment after physical death is described in a striking way. The consciousness no longer possesses the five senses. The soul becomes what scholars call a pure vibrational entity, a being that no longer hears sound but directly feels vibration. This idea is not limited to Tibetan mysticism. Quantum consciousness theorists like Penrose and Hameroff propose similar models, that consciousness is structured not through matter, but through frequency, resonance, and information fields. In this state, perception becomes immediate, unfiltered, and shockingly intimate. Thus, when the monk speaks over the body, his chant is not heard through ears. It is absorbed. The sound becomes a wave that ripples directly through the consciousness of the departed. And in this first moment of transition, the monk recites, "O soul, you have shed the shell of the body. Fear not, for everything you see now is nothing but the shadow of your own mind." This sentence may be the most psychologically profound line in the entire Tibetan canon. Why? Because it implies that at the moment of death, the external world dissolves, and the mind becomes the sole architect of reality. There is no outside. There is only projection. To the Western philosophical ear, this echoes Kant's transcendental idealism, the idea that the world as we know it is shaped by our perception. But the Tibetan tradition goes one step further. After death, the world is not simply shaped by perception. It is created by it. This is the beginning of what Tibetans call the Bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. 2. The first light, the encounter with the soul's true nature. As the soul absorbs the monk's chant, something extraordinary happens. The vibrations of sound give way, and the soul suddenly perceives light, not a light that shines on things, but a light that contains all things. The Tibetan Book of the Dead states, immediately after death, the soul beholds the pure light, the light of the Buddha, and simultaneously the light of its own true nature. This moment is called the first clear light, the radiant truth of what we fundamentally are, when stripped of every illusion, identity, and psychological mask. From a philosophical perspective, this moment mirrors the core of multiple Western traditions. Plato's idea of the good, the source of all reality. Spinoza's substance, the infinite indivisible essence of existence. Plotinus's one, the silent source of all consciousness. Heidegger's Lichtung, the clearing where being reveals itself. In every case, the light is not a symbol of salvation. It is the unveiling of what is eternally real. It is the moment where the soul sees itself without distortion. But here lies the paradox. The human soul, conditioned by fear and identity, usually cannot bear this light. It is too honest, too vast, too absolute, because this light demands the dissolution of the ego, and the ego is terrified of disappearing. Thus, according to the Tibetan masters, most souls react in the same way. They retreat, they turn away, they flee back into darkness, and that single act, the refusal to face truth, becomes the first step toward rebirth. 3. The shadow of fear, the birth of the inner hell. The moment the soul turns from the light, a shadow rises around it, what Buddhism calls ignorance, avidya, and psychology calls ego defense mechanism. The soul longs for something familiar, its body, its memories, its old identity, but none of that exists anymore. So the mind grasps at impressions, symbols, and unresolved emotions. And then it happens. The unconscious begins to project. Repressed anger bursts forth as fire. Greed takes shape as a devouring wave. Jealousy becomes a blade that turns against the self. This is what spiritual psychology calls the self-generated hell. There is no demon, no eternal punishment, no external inferno. The only tormentor is the mind that refuses to let go. Dante described hell as a place where the lost souls go, but the Tibetan tradition is far more radical. Hell is not a destination. It is a psychological event. It appears only as long as the mind clings to fear and identity. Sartre said, hell is other people. But the Tibetan masters counter with a far more piercing truth. Hell is not the other. Hell is everything within you that you refuse to face. In this sense, the afterlife becomes something deeply familiar to Western psychology, a mirror of one's own unresolved psyche. 4. The light is not salvation, it is self-recognition. The greatest misunderstanding of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the belief that the light is salvation. It is not. The light does not rescue you. It does not redeem you. The light simply reveals. Liberation occurs only when the soul has the courage to recognize the light as itself. The Buddha cannot save you. The gods cannot save you. The monk cannot save you. Only recognition can. This is the heart of what Buddhists call one's original face. The true self before birth, before identity, before fear. To see this face, even for a second, is to be free. To reject it is to fall again into illusion. Thus, the doctrine is brutally honest. Enlightenment is not a divine gift. It is a psychological readiness. If the soul can bear truth, it is free. If not, it wanders. 5. Why the first day after death matters even for the living. Now you may wonder, why does any of this matter while we are alive? Because the first clear light is not just a post-mortem event. It is a metaphor for every moment of awakening in our lives. Every time you confront your fear, every time you see a truth you once avoided, every time your identity cracks open and something deeper emerges, you are encountering the first light. Death simply magnifies the process, and this is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead is ultimately not a guide for the dead, but a training manual for the living, a journey not into death but into ourselves. On the first day after death, the universe does not abandon the soul. It reveals it. It strips away illusion. It invites the soul to meet itself. Some run, some tremble, a rare few open their eyes. But in every case, the light waits with infinite patience. Because the light is not something you reach, it is something you recognize. And so, as we continue this journey into the Bardo, this map of consciousness beyond the body, remember, this is not a story about death. It is a story about who you truly are, when nothing is left to hide behind. If you wish to continue this deep exploration into the nature of the soul, and walk with me through the next gates of the Bardo, then please subscribe. Your presence here is another light on this path. In this session, we delve into one of the most intriguing and philosophically rich passages from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the experience of the deceased on the first day after death. To the untrained eye, this moment may appear mystical, metaphorical, or even unreal. But when we examine it through the lenses of psychology, depth psychology, philosophy, and consciousness studies, we find that this ancient text describes something astonishingly precise: the rebirth of the unconscious mind, on the first day after death, a psychological interpretation. Carl Jung once described death not as annihilation, but as the completion of individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious into a whole. He believed that even after the physical body dissolves, the psyche continues to exist in the form of symbols, images, and archetypes. So when the newly deceased encounters light and darkness, gods and demons, the Tibetan masters say, these are not external beings. They are projections of your own mind. And Jung would have agreed. For him, the unconscious speaks in symbols, and death is the moment when these symbols rise without resistance. Everything hidden, everything buried, everything unresolved bursts into view. Thus, the monk's recitation beside the dying person is not merely ritual. It is a form of psychological reintegration, a last attempt to help the fragmented psyche recognize itself. Every vibration of the monk's voice, every syllable of the sacred text, serves a purpose: to bind the scattered pieces of the unconscious back into unity. This is the psychological meaning of liberation. 2. A parapsychological interpretation, the soul as energy. Next, let us shift our lens to parapsychology. In this field, the soul is not conceptualized as a ghost or specter, but as a distinct energetic entity, an energy pattern with its own natural frequency. Death is not a stoppage. It is a transformation, an energetic shift. The frequency that once expressed itself through a three-dimensional body now moves into a four-dimensional field, and the monk's mantra performs an extraordinary function. It stabilizes this energy. Sound, after all, is vibration. Brainwaves are vibration. Emotion is vibration. And vibrations interact. So when the monk recites, the mantra forms a stable wave pattern that harmonizes the chaotic frequency of the transitioning soul. This is resonance not metaphorically, but in a literal energetic sense. Thus, the monk's chant is not prayer in the Western petitionary sense. It is a deliberate act of psycho-spiritual tuning, a realignment of consciousness, a return to equilibrium. 3. The soul's dilemma: reincarnate or liberate. At this moment, on the first day after death, the soul stands at a crossroads, to enter the light or to turn back toward darkness. The light feels overwhelming. The light dissolves the ego. The light promises total truth, which also means the end of everything false. The darkness, on the other hand, feels familiar. It contains the memories, identities, and desires through which the ego once defined itself. This is what philosophers call the paradox of existence. We become complete only in the light, but in that completeness our individuality disappears. So most souls hesitate, and hesitation becomes gravity. Gravity becomes return. Return becomes rebirth. We receive a name, a family, a story, a life, a new cycle of desire and disappointment, a new cycle of joy and suffering. But the monk whispers a final instruction. You are already a Buddha. You do not need to be born again. Enter the light. It has no beginning and no end. This is liberation, not escape but recognition. 4. Death as a mirror, a philosophical reflection. And now we arrive at the central insight. Death is not the disappearance of the self. It is the appearance of the truth the self has always carried. On the first day after death, the soul finally sees, not the world, not the gods, not heaven or hell, but itself. This is the first moment of pure self-awareness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches us, hell is not other people. Hell is the mind's refusal to see itself. This is where psychology, Buddhism, and modern consciousness studies converge. Liberation is not achieved by fleeing darkness, nor by chasing the light. Liberation begins the moment we stop running, the moment we calmly see what is within us. My friends, this teaching is not simply about death. It is about life. Every fear we carry, every shadow we avoid, every unresolved desire we bury, all of these will meet us again at the threshold of death, not to punish us, but to reveal us. So I hope today's reflection offers you a glimpse, a small ray of understanding. If you wish to explore more about consciousness, death, rebirth, and the inner dimensions of the human mind, I invite you to subscribe. This channel does not speak of death to frighten you. It speaks of death to illuminate life. In our next lecture, we will explore the soul's second day after death, the lights of the deities and the visions born of desire. Your subscription is not simply a click. It is a conscious step toward the light of understanding. Thank you. The second day after death, the visionary landscape of the Chönyi Bardo, a philosophical journey into consciousness, projection, and the luminous mind. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. In many cultures, death is treated as a boundary, a firm and irreversible line. Yet across the world's great spiritual traditions runs a quiet and persistent whisper: consciousness does not end. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, a text both mystical and surprisingly psychological, states this without hesitation. Even after death, consciousness does not cease. Today, I invite you to walk with me into the second day after death, the realm called the Chönyi. Bardo, often translated as the Bardo of the apparent reality. This is the stage where the deceased encounters peaceful deities, wrathful deities, radiant lights, and terrifying shadows. But here is the profound twist. None of these beings are external gods. They are projections of the mind, shaped by one's karma, habits, desires, and fears. This is not mythology. It is a psychology of the soul. Before we begin, I want to welcome all new viewers. This channel explores death, consciousness, and the universal light that transcends religions and cultures. If this journey calls to you, I invite you to subscribe and stay connected as we continue unfolding these timeless teachings. Now let us begin our exploration of the second day. 1. The threshold between light and shadow. The first day after death, according to the Tibetan tradition, offers the deceased a chance to recognize the brilliant light of their own true nature. This is the primordial light, a flash of absolute clarity, which many Western philosophers might compare to Plato's form of the good, or what mystical Christianity calls the uncreated light. If the deceased recognizes this luminosity without fear, liberation is immediate. But most beings turn away, like someone waking from a dream, startled by a light. Too bright, the soul averts its gaze. And so we enter the second day. Here the light dims. A subtle silence spreads across the afterlife landscape. It is not the silence of peace, it is the silence you feel right before a storm. The brilliance of yesterday recedes like a tide, leaving the deceased standing in a dim, shifting space where shapes are uncertain and sounds echo strangely. What vanished? Not the light itself, but the deceased's ability to face it. 2. The imaginal realm, where mind creates reality. On this second day, the deceased begins to see forms, some gentle, others terrifying. These include the peaceful deities Jade-sun, the wrathful deities Krobo, radiant lights of 5 colors, shadows, echoes, and strange manifestations. In Western terms, this stage resembles Jung's concept of the shadow and the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious. It is as if the psyche, freed from the physical brain, projects its entire interior world outward into a vast imaginal field. This is expressed beautifully in the classical line, 心之所现欢迎非真. What appears is the display of consciousness itself, a mere illusion, not an objective reality. This is the essence of Yogacara, the Buddhist mind-only school, which proposes that perception is always shaped by consciousness. We do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. In the Chönyi Bardo, this truth becomes literal. There is no external universe, only mind, unfolding itself, like a dream made visible. 3. The tension between awe and fear. As the deceased stands in this twilight space, a sound begins to emerge. It is distant at first, a low hum like the droning of monks chanting across mountains. Then comes the faint ring of bells, delicate, crystalline. The sound is mesmerizing, yet unsettling. The deceased feels two impulses. This is heavenly. Follow it. And, no, this is a trap. It is testing your desires. This internal conflict is the essence of the second-day experience. It is not about heaven or hell. It is about recognition versus projection. The soul struggles to discern whether the phenomenon arises from its own mind or from some external authority. In modern psychological language, this is the moment when the self confronts its own unconscious material and is unsure whether to embrace it or flee. 4. The 5 lights of pure reality. Suddenly the dim landscape brightens. 5 rays of light descend from above. Blue, white, yellow, red, and green, each representing one of the 5 wisdoms and the 5 Buddha families. These lights are pure, gentle, and liberating. Yet at the same moment, 5 darker lights also appear. Gray, smoky, murky, manifestations of human desire, anger, ignorance, pride, and jealousy. The deceased is drawn to the darker lights because they feel familiar, comfortable, almost warm. The brighter lights feel too intense, too honest, too revealing. This is the drama of the second day. Will we choose the light that liberates, or the light that matches our old habits? In many ways, this moment mirrors the moral and existential choices of life itself. We often avoid truth not because we dislike it, but because it demands that we change. 5. The disappearance of yesterday's peace. The text describes a moment of poignant realization. The deceased glances back, and the pure light of yesterday is gone. It was not taken away, it was simply ignored, and thus moved beyond reach. This is a universal human experience. How often in life do we overlook a moment of clarity, a moment of love, a moment of awakening, only to realize later that it has already passed? The Bardo is not merely about death. It is a mirror held up to the living. 6. The atmosphere thickens. The space around the deceased becomes heavy, not like physical weight, but like emotional pressure. The ground is uncertain. Is it soil? Is it mist? Is there even a ground? This disorientation reflects the collapse of the physical senses. Without the nervous system to stabilize perception, everything becomes fluid, symbolic, and dreamlike. A Western phenomenologist might describe this as the world losing its intersubjective coherence, the dissolving of the shared reality that kept experience grounded while alive. The soul now stands in a world shaped only by its own tendencies. 7. The stage of projection, peaceful and wrathful forms. Now the visions intensify. Peaceful deities appear first, serene, radiant, compassionate. But if the deceased cannot recognize them as expressions of their own mind, that serenity transforms, features distort, colors darken, faces twist into wrathful expressions. It is not punishment. It is not judgment. It is the mind struggling to accept its own truth. This is why the Tibetan masters insist, do not be afraid. Nothing here can truly harm you. You are witnessing your own mind. To the Western listener, this may recall the mystical insight of Meister Eckhart, who wrote that the soul encounters God only after passing through its own darkness, or the Hermetic maxim, as within, so without. In the Bardo, this is not metaphor. It is literal. 8. A turning point in the afterlife journey. The second day marks a threshold. Yesterday offered liberation through recognition. Today offers liberation through courage. If the deceased can face the projections without fear, even the terrifying ones, the illusions dissolve, and the underlying luminous nature reappears. If they cannot, they are drawn deeper into the cycle of delusion, toward the later stages of the Bardo, and eventually toward rebirth. This is why Tibetan teachers urge practitioners to become familiar with their own minds before death, not to escape death, but to avoid confusing one's inner landscape for an external reality in the Bardo. 9. Understanding the second day through Western eyes. For Western audiences, the Chönyi Bardo can be understood through 3 complementary lenses. 1. Psychological, a confrontation with one's subconscious projections. 2. Phenomenological, an experience of pure appearance without physical grounding. 3. Ethical and existential, a mirror showing us how our choices and emotional habits shape our perception both in life and beyond it. In this sense, the Bardo teaching resonates with Socrates' claim that the unexamined life is not worth living. The Bardo insists, the unexamined mind becomes your entire reality after death. As we stand here, metaphorically walking beside the deceased on the second day after death, we are not merely learning about an ancient Tibetan text. We are learning about ourselves. We are learning that fear, desire, and projection shape our reality more than we realize. We are learning that clarity requires courage. And we are learning that the light, our true nature, never disappears. We only turn away. If this journey into the nature of consciousness resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe and continue exploring these teachings with me. Together we walk not toward death, but toward understanding. The second day after death, choosing between light and shadow. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. In our previous session, we began exploring the profound landscape described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a text that insists with remarkable clarity that consciousness does not vanish with death. Rather, it continues into a series of transitional states known as bardos. Today, we continue into the second day after death, the realm known as the Chönyi Bardo, or the Bardo of apparent reality. This is the stage where the deceased encounters luminous beings, terrifying forms, and lights of overwhelming intensity. But here is the key truth. None of these are external gods or devils. They are manifestations of one's own consciousness, shaped by karma, memory, desire, and fear. Before we dive deeper, a warm invitation. This channel explores consciousness, death, the afterlife, and the universal principles that connect East and West. If these themes speak to you, I invite you to subscribe and walk this journey with us. Now let us enter the second day. 2. The voice of the blue light. On the second day, a voice calls out from a radiant blue light. Fear not, this blue luminosity is the light of truth. It is the radiance of the Dharmakaya, the body of reality, and it will wash away your anger and ignorance. Come forward. But the deceased trembles. The heart races. The blue light feels too powerful, too honest, too overwhelming. Then, a soft, gentle gray light appears to the side. Warm, comforting, familiar. It seems to whisper, "Come here. This is the light of the world you knew. Your family, your home, your desires. This is the light you belong to." The deceased hesitates. A subtle inner voice whispers, "The strong light will blind you. The softer one will bring peace." And the soul steps back. The blue light begins to recede. The gray light fills the space like a fog. And then like thunder splitting the sky, a voice roars, "You have chosen ignorance once again." The blue light disappears. Here, the Tibetan text describes something profoundly human. We often turn away from truth, not because it harms us, but because it exposes us. We prefer the familiar illusion over the unfamiliar liberation. 3. The procession of peaceful deities. Now the landscape shifts. Where the blue light once stood, a golden light rises warm, majestic, transcendent. From within this radiance emerge Samantabhadra Buddha and a host of bodhisattvas carrying lotus flowers, their faces serene yet brilliant. Samantabhadra, known in Mahayana Buddhism as one of the 4 great bodhisattvas, embodies the vows and practices of all Buddhas. He represents universal compassion and the active commitment to liberate all beings. And he speaks, "Return now. This golden light is the light of compassion. If you release your greed and anger, you may attain liberation. Here and now, their faces are beautiful, but that beauty is too intense, too revealing. It feels as though every fault, every unspoken desire, every moment of selfishness is suddenly visible. The deceased turns away. In that instant, the peaceful faces change. The compassion fades. Their expressions distort. Eyes turn red. Faces multiply, twisting into wrathful forms. And they proclaim, 'Because you have turned from truth, we now appear as the darkness within your own mind.' The sky shakes. The ground splits. The deceased begins to fall into the chasm. This is not punishment. It is psychology made visible. The peaceful deity becomes wrathful not because the deity changes, but because perception changes, because fear transforms the same reality into a different appearance. 4. A question for the modern mind. At this point, we must ask a profound philosophical question. If the Bardo visions are real, do they appear identically to everyone? Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, and atheist alike. The Tibetan Book of the Dead insists that these visions are universal, not cultural, not religious, not symbolic. They are what consciousness experiences when freed from the physical body, like dreams that become the entire sky. But if this is true, then a Christian, a Muslim, or a secular humanist should experience the same luminous beings, though perhaps interpreted through different symbolic frameworks. This opens a fascinating dialogue between religions. Let us consider how the second-day visions might appear to 3 individuals. 5. If the deceased was Catholic, a devout Catholic might not see Samantabhadra or the blue Dharmakaya light as a Buddhist image. Instead, the overwhelming blue light may appear as the Gloria, day the light of God's presence, the radiance described by mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila. The bodhisattvas may appear as angels, or as Christ in his transfigured form, radiant beyond bearing. And the gray light, perhaps it appears as the familiar world, the earthly attachments the gospel warns against. The voice saying, "You have chosen ignorance," may echo Christ's own words. Light has come into the world, but men love darkness rather than light. 6. If the deceased was Muslim, a Muslim may experience the radiant light as the Nur, the divine light frequently described in the Quran. The peaceful deities may appear not as Buddha figures, but as angels, particularly the recording angels, or the figures described in eschatological traditions. The overwhelming clarity might evoke the Quranic scene during the last day, when all illusions fall away, and the gray light might be interpreted as the comfort of worldly desire, the dunya, the lower world that distracts from God. 7. If the deceased was an atheist or materialist. This case is the most conceptually fascinating. An atheist may not interpret these phenomena religiously at all. The blue light may feel like a breakthrough of pure consciousness, a hyper-lucid state, like the clear white light reported in near-death experiences. The peaceful deities may appear as archetypal forms, figures of the psyche, symbols of integration or transcendence. The gray light may feel like the gravitational pull of old memories, the fading comfort of identity. The voice may register as the internal conflict between clarity and self-deception. And for the atheist, this moment may not be a religious revelation, but a psychological confrontation. 8. The universal mechanism beneath cultural filters. Thus, the imagery may change, but the structure remains the same. A bright, liberating light, a softer, familiar light, an invitation to awakening, a retreat into comfort, a distortion caused by fear, a descent into darkness, a new opportunity for recognition. In this sense, the Tibetan Book of the Dead offers not a Buddhist doctrine, but a universal map of consciousness, a phenomenology of the afterlife that transcends religious boundaries. It presents a mirror. What appears in the Bardo is what lies within ourselves, and that is why the second day is so crucial. It is the moment when we decide, consciously or unconsciously, whether to move toward liberation or deeper into illusion. If this journey into the second day of the Bardo has offered insight, if it has expanded your understanding of consciousness, or if it has opened new questions about the afterlife, I invite you to stay with this channel. Subscribe, join our community, and continue exploring these profound teachings with us. Our journey continues, and the next stage of the Bardo awaits. When we speak about death, we often imagine it as a boundary, a line that separates the known from the unknown, the comfort of the visible world from a mysterious realm that lies beyond our final breath. Yet across cultures, religions, and centuries of human longing, a remarkable pattern emerges. The dying do not simply encounter an external God, but the deepest architecture of their own conscience. In moments near death, the mind does not behave like a passive observer. Instead, it becomes a vast stage on which one's beliefs, memories, virtues, fears, and unhealed moral wounds take on form, color, and voice. What one sees at the threshold of death is not random. It is the shape of one's inner moral universe, projected outward with the vividness of a spiritual vision. This is why Buddhists may see bodhisattvas, Christians may see angels, and Muslims may hear the thunderous echo of divine judgment. But beneath these different images lies a single philosophical truth. At death, we confront the mirror of our own conscience, and that mirror takes the symbolic form we are most capable of understanding. Christian imagery, the procession of mercy. If the departed person was a Christian believer, they may encounter what appears to be a procession of divine mercy. A gold radiance rises before them. But this light is not the Buddhist Samantabhadra instead. It unfolds gently into the warm, maternal face of the Virgin Mary. Her smile carries the tenderness of a mother comforting a frightened child. Behind her, angels in white robes form an endless procession, and celestial harmonies shimmer like threads of gold falling from the heavens. "Child, do not fear," she whispers. The voice is soft, like a mother leaning close to soothe a sobbing child. In her hand she holds not a lotus, but a rose intertwined with a small crucifix, a symbol of both suffering and redemption. Overwhelmed, the soul begins to weep. "Lord, I have committed so many sins." Memories surge forward, moments of deceit, acts of selfishness, betrayals of love. Then the atmosphere changes. The heavenly choir falls silent. The angels' faces grow solemn. Their wings ignite in a blaze, and their radiant eyes sharpen into the sternness of judgment. "Mercy does not reach the heart that refuses repentance," a voice declares. Mary's smile fades. Her radiance shifts into the unyielding brilliance of divine justice. The soul collapses to its knees, but the light envelops him regardless. His sins, once hidden, become transparent. illuminated by the piercing clarity of conscience. And only then does the dying person realize the figures he encountered were not external beings. They were the manifested truth of his own conscience, shaped by the religious symbols he trusted throughout life. He has seen judgment not from the outside, but from within. Muslim imagery, the light of Allah, Nur Allah. If the dying person was a Muslim believer, then on the second day, another kind of light may appear, the golden, trembling radiance of Allah's Nur, the divine light. But this is not the compassionate glow of a Buddhist bodhisattva. It is the light of divine clarity, the light that reveals all truths. Within this brilliance appear two angels dressed in white munkar and nakir, the interrogators of the grave, the guardians of truth. They stand firm and solemn. Did you offer your prayers while alive? Did you refrain from falsehood? Did you give charity to the poor? The soul trembles. Yes, I believed in Allah, but I was not perfect. Their eyes cool, like steel in winter. The golden light darkens into a burning red, becoming a flame of interrogation. The angels are no longer gentle envoys, they embody divine justice. You believed, they say, but you did not fully surrender. The heavens open, revealing countless eyes. Watching him, the eyes of ultimate truth. The man collapses, crying out, Allahu Akbar, yet fear weighs heavily upon his voice. Suddenly the angels vanish. The heavenly brilliance dissolves, and the dying person realizes that he is sinking into the shadow of his own fears, a realm constructed from his incomplete obedience and lingering guilt. The light of Allah he saw was not an external deity descending from the sky, but the symbolic expression of his faith, his fear, and the moral imprint of the life he lived. The philosophical insight. In these encounters, whether Christian or Muslim, something remarkable becomes clear. Death confronts each soul with the shape of its own conscience. The symbols differ, the doctrines differ, the languages of the visions differ. But what shines through all of them is one universal truth. No one escapes the spiritual truth of their own life. The afterlife in these narratives is not merely a place. It is a revelation, the unveiling of the heart. And this is why these stories are not just religious tales. They are mirrors held up to us, urging us to ask, what do we carry within us? What truths have we avoided? What judgment might our own conscience reveal when all disguises fall away? These questions matter deeply, not only at death, but now in the lives we are living at this very moment. If reflections like these, where philosophy, psychology, and spiritual tradition converge, speak to you, I invite you to stay with this channel. Your subscription helps this community grow, and it allows us to explore these deeper questions together with clarity, humility, and courage. In the previous section, we explored how believers, whether Christian or Muslim, encounter at death not merely external divine beings, but the symbolic radiance of their own conscience, clothed in the religious imagery most familiar to them. The Virgin Mary's compassion, the stern angels of judgment, the blazing nur of Allah, all these appear as mirrors of the soul's deepest moral architecture. But this insight leads us to a profound question. If conscience manifests itself through the symbols of faith, what happens when a person has no faith at all? What appears before someone who insists that no God exists, no afterlife awaits, and no spiritual realm lies beyond death? At first glance, one might assume that an atheist would simply encounter nothing, pure oblivion, endless darkness. But the human mind, at the threshold of death, does not simply dissolve into silence. It turns inward, revealing whatever truths the person carried within themselves, regardless of belief. And so we enter the next scene, the death experience of a non-believer. The atheist experience, the self confronting the self. If the deceased was an atheist, then on the second day the scene begins much differently. No angels appear. No divine light rushes toward him. No ritual symbols rise from the horizon of consciousness. Instead, he remains in darkness, a deep, still void that feels neither hostile nor comforting, just empty. But then the darkness slowly begins to shift. A faint gold tint seeps into the blackness, as though a distant sun were rising behind layers of fog. The man forces a laugh. "This must be a neurochemical misfire," he mutters to himself. "Just a hallucination. The brain shutting down." He clings to this explanation, like a lifeline, for it is the only framework he trusts. Yet the golden glow continues to expand, and within it silhouettes begin to form, not divine figures, not angels, not gods, but simple human shapes, silent, still indistinct at first. He steadies himself. Who are they? What is this? The figures do not speak. They merely smile, a soft, quiet smile that feels strangely familiar. A sensation stirs within him. Not fear, not awe, something far more unsettling recognition. In that moment, understanding strikes him with the force of revelation. These figures are the people he wounded during his life, the ones he dismissed, the vulnerable individuals he overlooked or belittled, the broken relationships he refused to repair, the kindness he withheld when it mattered most. The smile on their faces begins to twist, not in cruelty, but in sorrow, the sorrow of truth long denied. He tries to run, but there is nowhere to go. There is no God condemning him, no angel blocking his path. The walls closing around him are made of his own memories, his own actions, his own choices. "This isn't a hell created by some deity," he cries. "This is a hell created by me." The golden light turns red, pulsing like a furnace. Every memory he tried to bury ignites, burning with painful clarity. The people he hurt step closer, not to accuse him, but simply to exist undeniable, unescapable. He screams into the glowing emptiness. "If there is no God, then why am I being judged? Why is this happening?" Amid the flames, a quiet voice rises, not divine, not supernatural, but emerging from somewhere deep inside him. "This judgment was always yours. You have been judging yourself all along." And in that moment he understands. There is no external judge, no supernatural tribunal. The light he sees is not God. It is the illumination of his own conscience, the memory of every truth he denied, every hurt he justified, every responsibility he refused to bear. He has not encountered a deity. He has encountered himself, the self he avoided, the self he feared, the self he refused to acknowledge during life. It is not a divine mirror. It is the mirror he has been carrying within him all his life. The philosophical meaning, a universal mirror. When we place the Christian vision, the Muslim vision, and the atheist vision side by side, a remarkable pattern emerges. For the Christian, conscience appears as the Virgin's mercy and the angel's judgment. For the Muslim, it appears as the blazing nur and the stern interrogation of Munkar and Nakir. For the atheist, conscience appears as the silent procession of memories, the unavoidable truth of every harm ever inflicted. Different symbols, different languages, different cosmologies. Yet beneath all of these experiences lies one universal principle. Death does not introduce us to a new moral reality. Death reveals the moral reality we shaped within ourselves. Religious people meet their conscience in the forms their hearts understand. Atheists meet their conscience directly, without symbols to soften the blow. This does not diminish religion, nor does it exalt unbelief. Rather, it unveils a profound psychological and spiritual truth. In the end, every soul stands before the truth of its own life, and that truth takes the form we are most prepared to see. This is why these death narratives matter. They are not mere mythology. They are philosophical meditations on the nature of conscience, responsibility, and the inner life. And for us who are still living, they pose a gentle but urgent challenge. What truths are we avoiding today? What harm have we left unattended? What light or what shadow are we shaping within ourselves? For whatever we shape now is what we may one day encounter. If this exploration of conscience, death, and human moral psychology resonates with you, I invite you to stay with this channel. By subscribing, you help this community grow a community dedicated to thoughtful, compassionate, and courageous inquiry into the mysteries of life and the truths that shape us. Let us continue this journey together. One light, many faces, what all souls see after death. When we look across these stories, the Christian who sees the Virgin Mary, the Muslim who is greeted by the blazing nur of Allah, the atheist who faces a hall of mirrors built from his own conscience, a deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. These visions differ in language, symbolism, and emotional tone, yet they all revolve around one central experience, a radiant encounter with something profoundly illuminating, sometimes comforting, sometimes terrifying, but always unavoidably truthful. So the question naturally arises, if their religions are different, why is the light the same? And what does that tell us about consciousness, death, and the universal structures of the human mind? With that in mind, let us move into the heart of today's reflection. One light, many faces, the universal experience beyond religion. Ultimately, although religions speak different theological languages, the light that appears at the threshold of death is strikingly similar. In Buddhism, it may appear as the compassionate radiance of Samantabhadra. For a Christian, it may emerge as the gentle presence of the Virgin Mary. To a Muslim soul, it may shine as the holy nur of Allah, accompanied by angels of truth. And for a non-believer, the light may arise as the undeniable presence of conscience, a mirror reflecting every choice, every wound, every unspoken regret. Different symbols, different faces, yet all of them point to the same origin, a luminous intelligence that reveals truth. This is why the Bardo, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, explains that the gods and visions appearing before the newly departed are not external deities in the literal sense. They are manifestations of one's own mind, mirrors of truth shaped by faith, morality, fear, and longing. Thus, even if a person is not Buddhist, they still meet the same fundamental radiance, but clothed in the form most meaningful to their inner world. What they see is not a foreign god, but the symbolic language of their own soul. And the text teaches, only those who can stand before this light without fear, only those who can face truth without fleeing, are finally released from the wheel of rebirth and enter genuine freedom. Why one light is not just a metaphor. Psychological and scientific perspectives. The idea that the religions differ but the light is one is not merely poetic. It resonates with decades of research on near-death experiences, NDEs, across cultures and religious groups. Numerous medical studies report remarkably similar phenomena. Passage through a tunnel toward intense light. Encounter with a loving or awe-inspiring presence. A panoramic life review seeing one's entire moral history. A sense of leaving the body. Distortion of time. And in some cases, terrifying or judgment-like visions. These patterns appear regardless of religious belief. A report summarized in Scientific American, in the article Lifting the Veil on Near-Death Experiences, notes that 5–10% of the general population is estimated to have had an NDE at least once. Among people revived from medical emergencies, 10–23% report NDE phenomena. In other words, the light experience, is not confined to Buddhist mystics or Christian saints. It is a near-universal human event. Research from the University of Virginia School of Medicine adds another layer. Not all NDEs are peaceful. Approximately 11–22% involve darker, more frightening elements. Experiences that resemble judgment, fear, confrontation, or existential exposure. Even here, the theme remains the same. Light and shadow revealing the truth of the self. This aligns perfectly with our guiding insight. Different religions, one light. Buddhism might describe this light as the radiance of dharmic reality. Christianity might see in it the presence of divine love. Islam might understand it as the nur of Allah. Atheists might interpret it as the mind unveiling its deepest layers. Different names, same phenomenon. As Raymond Moody's groundbreaking work, Life After Life, showed in 1975, people of all backgrounds report encounters with luminous beings. Whether or not they believed in a deity, the light seems less tied to doctrine and more tied to human consciousness itself. The universal structure of the final vision. When we synthesize these accounts, a striking conclusion emerges. The soul does not meet the God of a religion. It meets the truth it has carried within itself. For the Christian, that truth may appear as Mary or an angelic host. For the Muslim, it may take the form of questioning angels and divine radiance. For the atheist, it appears as the full weight of memory and conscience. Yet the light behind all these forms is fundamentally the same. This is why the Bardo teaches, "What appears before you is the display of your own mind." The faces may differ, but the underlying illumination is one. So when we say, "The religions differ, but the light is one," we are not merely speaking in metaphor. We are describing a profound convergence between spiritual tradition, neuroscientific observation, and human testimony across cultures. At death, we do not meet a stranger. We meet the truth we have lived. And perhaps the deepest question is this: will we have the courage to face that light without fear? If reflections like these move you, I invite you to subscribe and continue this journey with us. A journey into consciousness, philosophy, and the mysteries that await us all at the edge of life. The one light beyond all faiths, and the descent into the red dawn. When we left off, we explored a profound insight echoed across cultures, religions, and near-death experience research. Religions differ, but the light is one. Buddhists speak of the radiant compassion of Samantabhadra. Catholics describe the tender presence of the Virgin Mary. Muslims speak of the luminous angels, the nur of God. Even atheists report a presence shaped not by doctrine, but by conscience, memory, and truth. These are not separate gods in competition, but diverse faces of a single phenomenon. The mirror of truth appearing in the symbolic language each psyche understands. Modern near-death experience studies reinforce this. Whether the experiencer is Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, atheist, or secular, many describe a radiant light, a presence of overwhelming love, a review of one's life, a sense of timelessness, a transformation of their worldview afterward. This is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead does not impose a dogma. It describes the structure of consciousness itself, and consciousness, at the threshold of death, speaks a universal language light. But here lies a deeper mystery, and one that sets the stage for the next phase of the Bardo journey. If the first day reveals the light of truth, then what emerges on the second day? If the compassionate deities reflect the clarity of our conscience, what then reflects our fear, our hatred, our unresolved guilt? This leads us into the next valley of the journey, the day when the wrathful gods arise. And so we turn to the ancient text again. The second day, the rising of the wrathful deities. The transition is sudden. The golden radiance fades and the world turns crimson. The sky cracks open with the smell of iron and flame. Thunder rolls like the beating of war drums. In this hellish landscape stand terrifying beings, their faces contorted, skull cups in their hands, serpents coiled around their heads, and countless eyes staring directly into the soul of the newly departed. These are the wrathful deities. Yet the tradition tells us these beings are not demons. They are the mind made visible. Their fire is the fire of our own anger. Their monstrous eyes are our unacknowledged fear. Their skull cups hold the bitterness of our own guilt. The Bardo text described them shouting, "You abandoned the light of truth. Now you must walk through the shadows you created." The deceased tries to run but cannot. The ground itself becomes heavy, binding the feet. And then the truth becomes clear. It is not demons that hold him. It is attachment. The illusions of my wealth, my family, my reputation. They reach upward like ghostly hands refusing to let go. The deceased screams, "I'm not ready! Not yet!" Lightning cracks across the sky, and the wrathful gods laugh, a sound like stones splitting beneath the earth. Those who are unprepared, they say, return to the darkness they fear, the collapse of reality. Then comes the next stage of the second day. The world begins to twist. Space itself bends. The sky folds inward. The ground slides like liquid. Faces emerge from the collapsing horizon. Faces the deceased knew in life. People he resented. People he loved but abandoned. People he harmed or deceived. And people he wished to forget. These faces merge into grotesque forms. They whisper in a single voice, "We are the karma you created." He covers his ears, but the whispers echo inside his mind, rising like a storm tide until they drown everything. And suddenly, silence. No sound, no form, no light. Only one thing remains, pure fear. And in that fear, a realization dawns. Everything he saw was a projection of his own consciousness. The shadows of his heart. The wrathful eyes were his own anger. The monsters of greed were the shadows of his own desires. The entire collapsing world was his ego, losing its grip on the illusion of solidity. From a distant place, a dim light appears. But now it is farther away. Each step he tries to take pushes it even farther still. A voice whispers. The third day approaches. If you fail to recognize these visions as your own mind, the gates of deeper illusion will open. And with that, he is left alone in the dark. Psychological and philosophical interpretation. The Tibetan masters understood something. Modern psychology only began articulating in recent centuries. The mind externalizes its deepest fears when the ego dissolves. Why is the sky turning upside down? Why does the ground dissolve? Why does space distort? Because these visions symbolize the death of the structures we once depended on. The sky flipping is the collapse of belief systems. The ground dissolving is the collapse of identity. Space warping is the collapse of time and ego-bound perception. Death strips away every anchor we once used to define ourselves. In Buddhism, this is mind projection Xinxiang, the mind confronting itself in its rawest form. In psychology, it is known as self-confrontation or the eruption of repressed memory, shadow material, and the death of the ego. This is why the deceased sees the faces of those he hated or abandoned. The unresolved emotional residues of a lifetime crystallizing into form. The purpose is not punishment. It is revelation. Fear becomes the mirror, and only when the deceased realizes, "These monsters are me," does the fear dissolve back into light. If he refuses this insight, the fear becomes a prison. If he accepts it, fear becomes liberation. This is the philosophical heart of the second day. So the journey continues, from the one light that transcends religion into the burning mirrors of the second day, where our unhealed inner world rises in symbolic form. The message is simple, ancient, and universal. In the Bardo, nothing comes from outside. We meet only ourselves. If you found this exploration meaningful, and you'd like to continue journeying with me through the mysteries of consciousness, death, and the human mind, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us dive deeper into these philosophical paths with clarity and compassion. Thank you for being here. Before we move deeper into the journey of consciousness after death, we must pause and recognize a profound truth. What collapses in moments of fear is never the universe, it is the ego. And what appears as a demon in the darker passages of the Bardo is not an external being. It is the shadow we ourselves have created through our actions, emotions, and unhealed memories. Many ancient texts describe these experiences with symbolic language: earth-shaking, skies turning dark, deities appearing, or terrifying visions unfolding. But the Tibetan Book of the Dead is remarkably clear about its purpose. These visions do not exist to punish. They exist to awaken. As we enter what the text calls the second day of the Bardo, we arrive at one of the most psychologically rich and spiritually intriguing symbols in all of world literature, the karma mirror. And today I'd like to guide you through this moment not only as a religious metaphor, but as a profound window into the human mind. If you find meaning in this journey, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so we can continue exploring these deep intersections between ancient wisdom, psychology, and the human condition, philosophical, psychological, Western-friendly, and continuous with the introduction. On the second day, the departed consciousness encounters what Tibetan tradition calls the mirror of karma. At first glance, it appears like a scene from divine judgment, an immense mirror revealing every deed one has committed. But the text insists this is not a heavenly courtroom. Instead, it is a psychological event, a final interior process of self-integration. In modern psychological language, the karma mirror functions as the mind's last attempt to become whole. Freud would describe this as the collapse of repression. Jung would call it the emergence of the shadow trauma therapists would recognize in it, the beginning of re-experiencing, the very gateway through which healing begins. 1. The first karma mirror. The unconscious confronts the ego. Immediately after death, the ego still functions as though it had a body. It still assumes the world is solid, that identity is fixed, that its story continues forward. But as the body dissolves, the ego loses its anchor. It can no longer project outward. It can no longer hide behind distractions, social roles, or physical sensations. At that moment, the unconscious rises like a tidal wave. Everything that has been forgotten, suppressed, denied, or strategically ignored begins to return not as random memories, but as a seamless narrative. The Tibetans describe this as a visionary film. In contemporary terms, we call it the life review, often reported in near-death experiences. People who return from NDEs consistently say, "My entire life passed before me in an instant. But I wasn't merely watching it, I was feeling it again." This is the key. The mirror of karma does not replay memory. It replays emotion. It restores the full weight of one's choices, words, and impacts on others not as an external judgment, but as an inner reckoning. Far from being moralistic, this process is deeply therapeutic. The unconscious is returning emotional responsibility to the ego. It is showing everything you refuse to feel while alive must now be reintegrated. 2. The second mirror, the revelation of the shadow. Carl Jung once wrote, "The soul's maturity begins the moment one faces their own shadow." This is the essence of the second mirror. Here, the departed encounters not a deity, but the reflection of everything they rejected in themselves: anger, jealousy, selfishness, hidden desires, guilt, and unprocessed grief. These are not sins in a Christian sense, nor punishments from outside. They are fragments of the personality seeking reintegration. In Jungian psychology, the shadow contains all parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. In the Bardo, the shadow finally steps forward. Tibetan teachers put it with elegant simplicity: the peaceful deities are the compassion of your mind. The wrathful deities are the shadows of your mind. In Western terms, we meet both our highest potential and our most denied self. And the message is clear: you cannot become whole without embracing the part of yourself you have spent your life rejecting. Only through this confrontation does the consciousness begin its ascent toward transcendence. 3. The third aspect: re-experiencing as the beginning of healing. The Tibetans describe the soul reliving its actions, the pain it caused others, the harm done intentionally or unintentionally. This is not punishment. In trauma psychology, this process is known as re-experiencing, and it is the first step toward healing. Human beings do not heal by forgetting. They heal by bringing what was hidden into the light of awareness. This is precisely what happens in the mirror. The soul feels again the anger it inflicted, the lies it told, the selfishness it justified, the opportunities for kindness it ignored. And as the consciousness relives these events, something unexpected happens. Guilt dissolves, fear softens, and what arises in its place is compassion. We might call this a moral awakening. The Tibetans call it the birth of wisdom. When the departed reaches this moment, they often arrive at a realization expressed beautifully in the text. If this is my shadow, then my mind can transform it. And if my mind transforms, so will the world around me. This is the breaking of illusion, the recognition that the outer world of the Bardo is a projection of the inner mind. 4. The fourth, meaning the mirror is not judgment, but mercy. Ultimately, the mirror of karma exists not to condemn, but to heal. It is not divine wrath. It is the mind's final opportunity to purify itself. Tibetan teachers say, do not fear the visions in the mirror. They are only your own creations. Recognize them and they become light. The scary images, monsters, painful memories, feelings of guilt are not punishments. They are signals from the unconscious whispering, you are still capable of love. Even at the edge of death, even in the darkest corridor of the Bardo, the human mind still reaches toward integration, compassion, and awakening. If this exploration of the karma mirror has sparked something in you, a curiosity, a question, or a deeper reflection about the mind and its hidden landscapes, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Together, we will continue our journey through philosophy, psychology, and the ancient wisdom of the Bardo, uncovering what it truly means to awaken. As we saw in the second day of the Bardo, the mirror of karma is not a tool for divine punishment, nor a celestial judgment imposed from outside. Rather, it is the mind's ultimate act of self-reckoning, a reflection of the shadow we carry, and a chance for mercy through fear. The frightening visions, the monstrous faces, the collapsing skies, they are not punishments but invitations. They call the consciousness to recognize a profound truth. Everything we perceive in fear is but a mirror of ourselves. Every deity of wrath, every terrifying illusion is born from our own unhealed desires, guilt, and attachments. Today we continue our exploration of the Bardo, moving from the second day's confrontation with shadow, fear, and karma into a deeper understanding of the transformative power of self-reflection. If this journey resonates with you, subscribe. Now your presence here fuels our shared exploration of consciousness, philosophy, and spiritual insight. On the second day, the departed encounters a colossal mirror floating in the darkness. It rises like a fragment of the sky itself, immense and inescapable. Within its reflective surface, the entire life of the departed is displayed not selectively, not forgivingly, but completely every lie told, every cruelty enacted, every selfish desire, every act of neglect. The mirror is silent, yet it speaks in the language of the soul. This was your life, and now these seeds of karma, where will they lead you? The departed closes their eyes, but the vision does not fade. This is not mere observation, it is re-experiencing. All pain, all guilt, floods back into the consciousness, unfiltered, unsoftened. From the distance comes a deep, resonant sound, the beating of a drum. Dum, dum, dum. The third day approaches. The second day, then, is a moment of paradox in the midst of fear and darkness. A glimmer of insight emerges. Though the light has receded, leaving the consciousness adrift in a void, a faint smile begins to awaken. It is the recognition of the shadow, of the parts of oneself long denied. Yes, this was the shadow of my mind. If my mind can transform, then perhaps the world itself can transform. Yet, the moment this thought arises, the cosmic landscape twists anew. A new door opens, revealing even greater illusions, more formidable and intricate than before. The departed steps forward, willingly into this new experience, aware that retreat is impossible, yet emboldened by understanding. This is the essence of the second day in the Bardo. Those who fail to recognize the light of the first day are drawn deeper into the illusions of their own making. The peaceful deities are the mercy of the mind. The wrathful deities are the shadow of the mind. They are not two separate entities. They are the same mind, perceived through different lenses. If one does not awaken to this unity, the light retreats and darkness thickens. In this sacred text, the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches, religion may differ, but the light is one. Whether it is the Bodhisattva of compassion in Buddhism, the Virgin Mary in Christianity, the Nur of Allah in Islam, or the conscience of an atheist, the light is singular. All appearances are but reflections of the same source, refracted through the lens of belief, culture, and inner consciousness. In other words, the deities, angels, and visions encountered after death are not literal entities to be worshipped or feared. They are mirrors of truth, appearing in forms that resonate with the mind's internal framework. Thus, when the consciousness confronts the mirror, it asks a question. Will you fear this light, or will you have the courage to see yourself within it? The answer determines the path forward. To close one's eyes is to remain bound by illusion, to face. The reflection is to step toward liberation. From a psychological perspective, the Bardo's mirror is strikingly analogous to concepts in modern psychotherapy. The re-experiencing of one's life, including unprocessed guilt, fear, and desire, mirrors the process of trauma integration. The mind, in extreme states, such as near-death experiences, returns suppressed memories for reconciliation. The shadow self emerges not to punish, but to invite healing, integration, and awakening. In fact, research on near-death experiences shows that the confrontation with light and consciousness is universal across cultures and religions. Whether one calls it bodhisattva, angel, divine, light, or inner conscience, the experience consistently reflects the mind seeks resolution, understanding, and unity even at the threshold of death. The second day of the Bardo, then, is a masterclass in self-awareness. Fear is not the enemy, it is the final threshold before transformation. The shadows, monsters, and terrifying illusions are not External, they are your own mind, inviting integration. The mirror asks not for penance, but for insight. And so, the text leaves us with a simple yet profound invitation. Recognize the light, embrace the shadow, and walk forward with courage. In conclusion, although religions, cultures, and beliefs vary, the underlying light, the truth of consciousness, is one. The Bodhisattva, the Virgin Mary, the Noor, and the human conscience are different, faces of the same mirror. The Tibetan Book of the Dead asks each of us, will you fear the light, or will you have the courage to see yourself reflected within it? If this exploration has sparked curiosity, reflection, or insight within you, I encourage you to subscribe and like this channel. Your support is the light that guides us through these deep inquiries into the nature of consciousness, the Bardo, and the profound journey of the human spirit. Thank you for walking this path of insight and courage with me. Thank you for joining me once again on this channel, where we explore death, consciousness, and the timeless wisdom that transcends every culture and every religion. If you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to join this journey, because what we discuss here is not entertainment, but a map for the deepest questions of human existence. Today we enter the second day of the Bardo, as described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Chönyi Bardo, the Bardo of the Luminous Apparitions. To the Western mind, this may sound like myth, metaphor, or mystical allegory. But if we listen carefully, not with superstition, but with philosophical openness, we may find something astonishing. A description not merely of life after death, but of how the mind reveals its true nature when everything we cling to has fallen away. The Tibetan master says, consciousness does not vanish after death. This is not a religious claim. It is a psychological and phenomenological one, because what is death if not the radical stripping away of the body, the senses, the self-narrative, and the roles we once played? What remains is the mind, not the everyday mind shaped by habit and fear, but the raw, unfiltered awareness that no longer has anywhere to hide. In the Chönyi Bardo, the deceased encounters lights, deities, peaceful beings, wrathful figures. But Tibetan philosophy insists these are not external gods. They are projections of the mind itself. 心之所显幻影非真, all appearances are, but the mind's own reflections illusory, not ultimately real. To the Western listener, think of Carl Jung's archetypes, the shadows and gods that arise from the collective unconscious. Think of Plato's cave, where the soul, upon leaving the body, confronts the blinding light of the real. Think even of modern neuroscience, where dreams, trauma, memory, and fear blend into symbolic landscapes. The Bardo is not a fantasy realm. It is a mirror of the self in its most honest and unforgiving form. The second day, the turning point of the soul. If the first day after death is the soul's chance to return to its original nature, to recognize the pure light of awareness, then the second day is the moment where most beings falter. Why? Because the truth is blinding. The light of consciousness is overwhelming, and the self, untrained in honesty, turns away. This is the tragedy of the human condition. We fear our own potential as much as we fear our own shadows. As the second day begins, silence descends. The radiant light of the first day fades, and the deceased stands in a curious darkness, not yet hellish, but heavy, humid, unfamiliar. Something has shifted. The world is no longer out there. It is inside. A distant sound arises, part chant, part bell, part whisper. It calls the soul forward, yet its ambiguity is unsettling. The deceased hesitates. Is this salvation? Or is this a trap? For the first time, the soul begins to distrust its own perceptions. This hesitation marks the doorway into confusion. It is the beginning of the descent into illusion. The 5 lights appear. Without warning, the sky opens. 5 streams of light descend, each pure, each symbolic, each a direct expression of awakened consciousness. But to the untrained mind, they are terrifying. The first is the blue light of Akshobhya, the Buddha of the Eastern direction, the embodiment of clarity and mirror-like wisdom. To the enlightened, blue light is the call to liberation. But to a mind still attached to earthly familiarity, it is too sharp, too honest. Akshobhya extends his hand toward the soul. Do not fear. This is the light of truth. Step forward and you will be free. But freedom demands courage, and the human heart is rarely ready. Beside the piercing blue light, a softer glow appears. The murky, comforting gray of ignorance and attachment. One promises truth, the other promises comfort. And like so many of us in life, the deceased chooses comfort. One step back, one glance away, one moment of hesitation, and the brilliant blue light recedes like a tide pulling away from the shore. A thunderous voice echoes not from outside, but from within. You have chosen ignorance once more. The peaceful procession turns to wrath. Another light emerges, golden, tender, radiant. Within it appear the peaceful Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, compassion embodied, mercy given form. Their smiles are warm enough to melt every fear. Their presence is the promise of salvation. One of them steps forward, a figure luminous and gentle. Even now, return. Let go of anger and craving. Liberation is still possible, but compassion has its own intensity. To the guilty, kindness feels like exposure. To the ashamed, purity burns. The deceased turns away once more, and in an instant the peaceful faces crack. The smiles harden, the eyes blaze. The compassionate forms dissolve into wrathful deities, not because the gods have changed, but because the mind has. The soul is not punished, it is confronted, because in the Bardo, nothing appears except what we have carried all our lives. And so when we consider this subtle movement of attention, this quiet but decisive turning of the mind, we begin to understand why the ancient texts insist that the first step toward liberation is seeing clearly without distortion, not heroic sacrifice, not dramatic demonstrations of faith, but this, to recognize the exact moment when our awareness begins to slip away from truth and toward illusion, because that moment, tiny, almost invisible, is the birthplace of suffering. It is in that first moment of distortion that anger grows its roots, fear takes shape, desire forms a narrative, and self-deception begins to justify itself. And this is why the masters say, awareness must be swift effort, must be constant, not because life is cruel, but because the mind is fast, faster than our emotions, faster than our intentions, faster than our moral commitments. Without disciplined awareness, the mind outruns us, pulling us into habits we did not choose, and reactions we do not endorse. The moral drift that happens when awareness lapses. Think of the last time you spoke sharply to someone you care about. The moment was small, perhaps only a few seconds, but in that instant your awareness narrowed, your breath tightened, and the mind seized control like an impulsive animal. You did not choose to harm them. You simply lost awareness for a moment, and the chain reaction completed itself. And afterward you felt regret. You said to yourself, I didn't mean it. I don't know why I reacted that way, but the truth is simpler. Awareness slipped, and the reactive mind filled the vacuum. This is what the ancients meant by failing to perceive early, failing to persevere consistently. It is not about moral weakness. It is about attentional poverty, a momentary bankruptcy of presence, and the consequences ripple outward. Sometimes it changes the mood of a single conversation, but other times it can alter the entire direction of a life, driving a wedge between partners, breaking trust between friends, or setting a family on a path of silent resentment, all from one moment of lost awareness. Awareness as an ethical power. When we hear the word awareness, in the modern world we often think of self-care, mindfulness apps, breathing exercises, or stress reduction. But the ancients saw awareness differently. For them, awareness is a moral force. It is the guardian of the heart. It protects our integrity. It defends our commitments. It prevents small impulses from becoming real harm. Awareness is the difference between a passing irritation and an act of cruelty. It is the difference between recognizing one's desire and becoming enslaved by it. It is the difference between a fleeting fantasy and a destructive decision. Without awareness, the mind is like a horse without reins, fast, powerful, beautiful, but capable of running off cliffs. With awareness, the same horse becomes a noble companion. This is why the tradition insisted winning against the self is not a matter of force, but of clarity. The self cannot be defeated through punishment. It can only be transformed through understanding, and understanding begins with awareness. Why early recognition matters. Every emotional storm begins as a drop. Every ethical failure begins as a whisper. Every tragedy begins as a subtle misalignment. If you can see the drop, you can prevent the flood. If you can hear the whisper, you can rewrite the story. If you can notice the misalignment, you can correct your course before the path diverges. This is why early awareness is more powerful than late effort. Late effort is repentance. Early awareness is wisdom. Repentance saves us from disaster, but awareness saves us from needing repentance at all. And this is the heart of a teaching. The purpose of spiritual discipline is not to build a rigid moral will that battles against impulses like an endless war. That is exhausting, unsustainable, and ultimately ineffective. The purpose is to cultivate a mind that detects the impulse before it becomes a force, that notices the emotion before it becomes a storm, that sees the confusion before it becomes a narrative. This quiet vigilance is what allows a human being to remain free, the mind's natural tendency to drift. Let us be honest. The mind prefers comfort over clarity, impulse over discernment, and habit over intention. Awareness requires effort. Drift requires nothing. This is why most people live their entire lives, reacting rather than choosing, surviving rather than understanding, worrying rather than awakening, not because they are immoral, but because they are inattentive. And inattentiveness is the universal human disease. It is the root of our conflicts, the engine of our addictions, the silent architect of our regrets. This is why the ancients emphasized constant effort, not heroic effort, not dramatic effort, but everyday effort, steady, gentle, rhythmic, like tending a garden. You do not pull the plant upward with force. You simply make sure it receives what it needs. Every single day, awareness is a garden. Effort is the sunlight. Thank you for joining me once again on this channel, where we explore death, consciousness, and the timeless wisdom that transcends every culture and every religion. If you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to join this journey because what we discuss here is not entertainment, but a map for the deepest questions of human existence. Today we enter the second day of the Bardo, as described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Chönyi Bardo, the Bardo of the Luminous Apparitions. To the Western mind, this may sound like myth, metaphor, or mystical allegory. But if we listen carefully, not with superstition, but with philosophical openness, we may find something astonishing. A description not merely of life after death, but of how the mind reveals its true nature when everything we cling to has fallen away. The mind after death, not extinguished but exposed. The Tibetan master says, consciousness does not vanish after death. This is not a religious claim. It is a psychological and phenomenological one. Because what is death if not the radical stripping away of the body, the senses, the self-narrative, and the roles we once played? What remains is the mind, not the everyday mind shaped by habit and fear, but the raw, unfiltered awareness that no longer has anywhere to hide. In the Chönyi Bardo, the deceased encounters lights, deities, peaceful beings, wrathful figures. But Tibetan philosophy insists these are not external gods. They are projections of the mind itself. 心之所显，幻影非真, all appearances are. But the mind's own reflections illusory, not ultimately real. To the Western listener, think of Carl Jung's archetypes, the shadows and gods that arise from the collective unconscious. Think of Plato's cave, where the soul, upon leaving the body, confronts the blinding light of the real. Think even of modern neuroscience, where dreams, trauma, memory, and fear blend into symbolic landscapes. The Bardo is not a fantasy realm. It is a mirror of the self in its most honest and unforgiving form. The second day, the turning point of the soul. If the first day after death is the soul's chance to return to its original nature, to recognize the pure light of awareness, then the second day is the moment where most beings falter. Why? Because the truth is blinding, the light of consciousness is overwhelming, and the self, untrained in honesty, turns away. This is the tragedy of the human condition. We fear our own potential as much as we fear our own shadows. As the second day begins, silence descends. The radiant light of the first day fades, and the deceased stands in a curious darkness, not yet hellish, but heavy, humid, unfamiliar. Something has shifted. The world is no longer out there. It is inside. A distant sound arises, part chant, part bell, part whisper. It calls the soul forward, yet its ambiguity is unsettling. The deceased hesitates. Is this salvation, or is this a trap? For the first time, the soul begins to distrust its own perceptions. This hesitation marks the doorway into confusion. It is the beginning of the descent into illusion. The 5 lights appear. Without warning, the sky opens. 5 streams of light descend, each pure, each symbolic, each a direct expression of awakened consciousness. But to the untrained mind, they are terrifying. The first is the blue light of Akshobhya, the Buddha of the Eastern direction, the embodiment of clarity and mirror-like wisdom. To the enlightened, blue light is the call to liberation, but to a mind still attached to earthly familiarity, it is too sharp, too honest. Akshobhya extends his hand toward the soul. Do not fear. This is the light of truth. Step forward and you will be free. But freedom demands courage, and the human heart is rarely ready. Beside the piercing blue light, a softer glow appears, the murky, comforting gray of ignorance and attachment. One promises truth, the other promises comfort. And like so many of us in life, the deceased chooses comfort. One step back, one glance away, one moment of hesitation, and the brilliant blue light recedes, like a tide pulling away from the shore. A thunderous voice echoes not from outside, but from within. You have chosen ignorance once more. The peaceful procession turns to wrath. Another light emerges, golden, tender, radiant. Within it appear the peaceful Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, compassion embodied, mercy given form. Their smiles are warm enough to melt every fear. Their presence is the promise of salvation. One of them steps forward, a figure luminous and gentle. Even now, return. Let go of anger and craving. Liberation is still possible, but compassion has its own intensity. To the guilty, kindness feels like exposure. To the ashamed, purity burns. The deceased turns away once more, and in an instant the peaceful faces crack. The smiles harden. The eyes blaze. The compassionate forms dissolve into wrathful deities. Not because the gods have changed, but because the mind has. The soul is not punished. It is confronted. Because in the Bardo, nothing appears except what we have carried all our lives. And so when we consider this subtle movement of attention, this quiet but decisive turning of the mind, we begin to understand why the ancient texts insist that the first step toward liberation is seeing clearly without distortion, not heroic sacrifice, not dramatic demonstrations of faith, but this, to recognize the exact moment when our awareness begins to slip away from truth and toward illusion. Because that moment, tiny, almost invisible, is the birthplace of suffering. It is in that first moment of distortion that anger grows its roots, fear takes shape, desire forms a narrative, and self-deception begins to justify itself. And this is why the masters say, awareness must be swift effort, must be constant, not because life is cruel, but because the mind is fast, faster than our emotions, faster than our intentions, faster than our moral commitments. Without disciplined awareness, the mind outruns us, pulling us into habits we did not choose, and reactions we do not endorse. The moral drift that happens when awareness lapses. Think of the last time you spoke sharply to someone you care about. The moment was small, perhaps only a few seconds, but in that instant your awareness narrowed, your breath tightened, and the mind seized control like an impulsive animal. You did not choose to harm them. You simply lost awareness for a moment, and the chain reaction completed itself. And afterward you felt regret. You said to yourself, I didn't mean it. I don't know why I reacted that way. But the truth is simpler. Awareness slipped, and the reactive mind filled the vacuum. This is what the ancients meant by failing to perceive early, failing to persevere consistently. It is not about moral weakness. It is about attentional poverty, a momentary bankruptcy of presence, and the consequences ripple outward. Sometimes it changes the mood of a single conversation, but other times it can alter the entire direction of a life, driving a wedge between partners, breaking trust between friends, or setting a family on a path of silent resentment, all from one moment of lost awareness. Awareness as an ethical power. When we hear the word awareness, in the modern world we often think of self-care, mindfulness apps, breathing exercises, or stress reduction. But the ancients saw awareness differently. For them, awareness is a moral force. It is the guardian of the heart. It protects our integrity. It defends our commitments. It prevents small impulses from becoming real harm. Awareness is the difference between a passing irritation and an act of cruelty. It is the difference between recognizing one's desire and becoming enslaved by it. It is the difference between a fleeting fantasy and a destructive decision. Without awareness, the mind is like a horse without reins, fast, powerful, beautiful, but capable of running off cliffs. With awareness, the same horse becomes a noble companion. This is why the tradition insisted winning against the self is not a matter of force, but of clarity. The self cannot be defeated through punishment. It can only be transformed through understanding, and understanding begins with awareness. Why early recognition matters. Every emotional storm begins as a drop. Every ethical failure begins as a whisper. Every tragedy begins as a subtle misalignment. If you can see the drop, you can prevent the flood. If you can hear the whisper, you can rewrite the story. If you can notice the misalignment, you can correct your course before the path diverges. This is why early awareness is more powerful than late effort. Late effort is repentance. Early awareness is wisdom. Repentance saves us from disaster, but awareness saves us from needing repentance at all. And this is the heart of Mundane One's teaching. The purpose of spiritual discipline is not to build a rigid moral will that battles against impulses like an endless war. That is exhausting, unsustainable, and ultimately ineffective. The purpose is to cultivate a mind that detects the impulse before it becomes a force, that notices the emotion before it becomes a storm, that sees the confusion before it becomes a narrative. This quiet vigilance is what allows a human being to remain free, the mind's natural tendency to drift. Let us be honest. The mind prefers comfort over clarity, impulse over discernment, and habit over intention. Awareness requires effort. Drift requires nothing. This is why most people live their entire lives, reacting rather than choosing, surviving rather than understanding, worrying rather than awakening, not because they are immoral, but because they are inattentive. And inattentiveness is the universal human disease. It is the root of our conflicts, the engine of our addictions, the silent architect of our regrets. This is why the ancients emphasized constant effort, not heroic effort, not dramatic effort, but everyday effort, steady, gentle, rhythmic, like tending a garden. You do not pull the plant upward with force. You simply make sure it receives what it needs every single day. Awareness is a garden. Effort is the sunlight.